My involvement with, I should just say, some of my slides will not show the very bottom line. So that should say University of Liverpool. So I'll give a plug to the university, which I'm a minor staff member. My involvement in the Caribbean began looking at sugar plantations with Professor Roger Leach in St. Kitts, Nevis' sister island, just across the water, of course. And Roger had a British Academy grant to investigate 2 parishes in the island. We were looking at sugar plantations, recording them, looking at what remains survived from those sugar plantations. And we were helped enormously by the existence of a superb map drawn by William McMahon in 1828, just before the emancipation. So McMahon's map, this is a small fragment of it, McMahon's map captured the landscape at a very crucial time, right at the end of the slavery era, when the plantations had reached, in some ways, reached their height, but were at that time in decline. So he's capturing a landscape then, which is total for the whole island. It's very rare. I think it's the only example in the islands where that total mapping is present. And you can see the huge amount of detail. Every plot, every field, every enclosure is plotted in great detail. And one of the very good things about the McMahon map is that it shows something which is very rare to find or to see any remains, any visible remains, which is the villages of the enslaved Africans. They're called Negro houses, and that's historical. But I've marked them on in red, and because those are, compared to the plantations, so very difficult to see, to have McMahon's map is extremely valuable. So what we were doing in St. Kitts then built up a pattern of understanding of what the sugar plantations looked like. We could see a series of the characteristics, several features which were very distinctive about the way the plantations were developed in St. Kitts. And one of the things that I was very interested in was to see how that would relate to Nevis. Those characteristics are, first of all, that the plantations were spread throughout the island in 1700, often very high up the hillside of the central mountain. But by the early 19th century, by the time the McMahon's map was drawn in 1828, many of those plantations had been abandoned. The higher plantations were abandoned. So we can see a pattern there of abandonment of plantations. They were difficult to cultivate along, narrow terraces, heavy runoff of rain depleted the soil nutrients so that the yields declined and they became unprofitable. So we can see a pattern there. The higher plantations go out of use by the early 19th century. And another feature of the plantations was that the smaller plantations, of which there were many in the 17th century, here in Nevis as well as in St. Kitts, tended to get amalgamated, tended to be bought out by the larger, richer planters and made into more economic units. The small plantations were really quite uneconomical. And we'll see a very good example of that in a few moments in Nevis. And then the third characteristic of plantations, which was very obvious, was, and every time we looked at plantation, we could see the similarities between them, and that is how work compounds were laid out in very tightly defined, highly standardized pattern. And that reflected the way in which sugar was made. There were certain features of sugar making which meant that that would determine the sequence of activities and would determine the layout of the plantation. And you can see here at Estridge, which I visited yesterday, and to my slight horror, had lost some buildings, and it's now a concrete block factory. But anyway, that's progress, perhaps. The building here, boarding house, it survived 20 years ago when I first recorded it. The windmill is still there. But what the sugar making process meant was that the sugar cane was crushed in here, the juice ran down. You can see down here into the boiling house where it's boiled into a dense liquid, which was then cured in a curing house in hogsheads or in pots, ceramic pots. And then there are ancillary buildings, there are the houses of the owner, the overseers, the storeroom, the distillery, and so on. And we can see a sort of standardised pattern of the elements of a sugar plantation, and they include very often owner's house and a detached kitchen and a garden and cisterns, and of course the village of the enslaved Africans too. So this pattern then became very common, very standardised. So in looking at the plantations in St. Kitts, we've got a very good idea of how these plantations were organised. Many of the planters, a number of the planters who owned land who owned plantations in St. Kitts also owned land or plantations in Nevis. And this cross-island ownership is very common in the 17th, the 18th century particularly. So it's likely then that there's going to be a standardised pattern across these islands and the Leeward Islands. So when we look at them on a map, and this is a map of Bendigo Matthews Estate near Basse-Terre. It's not a very good slide, I'm afraid, but in 1757. And you can see they're a very compact little square contained area. And the reason for this is to minimise the amount of space taken up by the plantation works to ensure that the maximum amount of cane could be grown. They didn't even, in many cases in the 18th century, didn't even grow provisions in the plantation formally, apart from the enslaved Africans who had their own grounds. But the food supplies often came from North America because cane production was so important and so lucrative. And there you can see that, so here we have the village of enslaved Africans, and there's the compact works. And there we are now coming a little bit closer to home. This is very close to Four Seasons, and this is the slave village there, Philpott plantation, in about 1818. And one of the nice things you can see here is the little huts, but you can also see the cultivated ground in front of many of the houses. So you can see that provisions may not have been supplied necessarily by the owners, but they were being grown by the enslaved Africans themselves. As I say, these are in Nevis. It's very hard to find this kind of sites. The slave villages are the least traceable. Plantation works are often much better defined than masonry. And so what we can do using a map such as McMahon is to extrapolate from McMahon what he showed in St. Kitts to the situation in Nevis. And if we're looking for where those slave villages might be, we can see they are very often on the edge of the gut. They're in low-lying land, often steep land. They're usually set downwind of the plantation itself. And you can see that the plantation owners are avoiding giving land to the enslaved Africans, which might impede their cultivation of cane. They're put in places where cane cultivation is difficult. So let's move on then. And let's just have a look. This is a wonderful watercolour, and I think it used to be in the Scotia Bank. It may still be there, but it's of Brimstone Hill. But what attracted my eye was this is a slave village, and it is fascinating because the detail you've got there is it's a very close site, very densely packed. But look at all the trees growing there. Many of these are fruit trees, so these are providing provisions for the enslaved Africans living in these relatively small huts. And there's a sort of dense settlement, no clear order, it seems, and that often seems to be the pattern, that they're not very well structured in terms of rectilinear layout, because the people themselves, the enslaved Africans, presumably had a choice about where they put their huts. So there was some agency, some degree of control over their lives. So let's look then at a couple of plantations, really three plantations, I suppose, in Nevis. And the first one is Upper Rawlins, which is on land owned by Edward Herbert. And Edward found in 1999, found a plantation on this land above Rawlins village, and there is the windmill of Rawlins, and then up here is somewhere around here, I think, is the focus of the plantation, but now heavily overgrown, quite high. It's at a height of 1,500 feet. So this is one of those plantations I was talking about earlier, which are well up into the hillside. So these are the marginal plantations where cultivation is difficult. They're using terraces. There's a little bit of flat ground, but they're using terraces. So this is a prime candidate for the kind of plantation which may well have gone out of use early on. So Edward heard very kindly allowed Roger Leach to investigate the site. Roger did a survey there. This is what it looked like just after a bit of clearance, but you can see a jumble of ruins, no clear structure evident there. But with the benefits of an archaeological eye and benefits of survey equipment, you can begin to unpick the landscape and see where the focus of the settlement is, focus of the plantation, and then you can see these walls, trackways which subdivide and delineate the plantation and its neighbours, and separated off from its neighbours. It's between, as you can see, between Dunbar and Hard Times. So a wedge of land which lies quite high up the hillside. And one of the beauties of looking at historical archaeology is the fact that we have a wealth of documents. And in the Nevis archives, the common records are a superb resource which gives a wealth of detail about land ownership, a wealth of detail about purchase and exchange of land, so you can track through the records if you can read the documents, and that can be a challenge. This is Roger Leach and Pam Leach and Josh Schumann, a student at the University of Southampton, some years ago, researching the records in the Nevis archives. And so that's enabled, the common records enabled Roger to work out where the plantation was and how it fell into the pattern of ownership. And this is our plantation on a plan that was drawn actually only as late as the 1990s, it's rather older than that. And you can see that the Upper Rawlins estate is again sandwiched between Zeppelins, Dunbar and Stony Hill, Hard Times down here. But it's a plantation that was first mentioned in 1762. It existed before that because we've got the archaeology that tells us that. But it was then owned by Michael Williams and Kit, Kit, whose name I have, of course, totally forgotten. I don't think you'll mind, but I think it is no longer with us. It then passed to the Pembertons in the 1780s and subsequently remained in the Pemberton family for some time. So that's our plantation. That's a reminder to put a slide image of this. And so what did we find in Upper Rawlins? Well, Upper Rawlins was a very interesting, small, early plantation that never really developed into, never got a windmill, never got a chimney, a steam mill. But here we can see the boiling trade, and this is a good example of a Spanish trade where each of these fireboxes or hearths heated a copper that was set above it separately. Now, that is very inefficient, and the much more efficient Jamaica trade then came in and with a firebox at one end and a single fire heater all of the coppers. Very much more developed and much more efficient. But you can see here a very clear example of that Spanish trade. So, and there we can see, this is New River of course, but we can see the same principle of these coppers. Here they're made of iron, but probably it's, I think it's quite likely that for Rawlins there were actually copper. And then mapping the whole site, you can begin to see that same pattern of compactness. You can see the structures are all set very close together, but top of the tree, as it were, the highest point, of course, is always going to be the mill, because the juice needs to flow down, so you've got to have that gravity. So that's always going to be the highest point. And there you can see it's an animal mill, so it would have been driven by animals rather than by wind. And then you can see there, this is the boiling house, that's the structure we've just been looking at. And then there's a cistern here, but this is probably a fuel store, another big cistern. And then here we have what is interpreted, I think, reasonably accurately as the main house, and then a little kitchen next door. And let's have a look at those in a little bit more detail, because you can see what the archaeology looks like. It's quite difficult, it's very overgrown for a start. But this is one of the copper settings. This is the clarifier, actually, it's the first copper. And there is the end is a gutter that ran out of the coppers. And there is another cistern, a very familiar feature in Nevis. But of course, how does the cistern collect its water? There's nothing around it now. It collects water from the roof of some structure which stands nearby. So that tells you then, gives you a hint that there was some sort of structure close by. But look at what's happened to the Upper Rawlins buildings, because this is quite, it was very difficult really to make any sense of this, because you can see there are buildings, you can see a little line of mortar plaster on the wall there, and there it is again. But the foundations are really reduced to the absolute minimum. There are no floors, probably would have had a wooden floor. But the whole structure, this is the great house, it's not that great. The main house, perhaps, would be more accurate. It's been reduced to almost it's the base of its foundations. And let's have a look at why that was, what's been happening here. And here you can see, this is what archaeologists spend a lot of their time doing, which is reading the layers that they excavate. So they're interpreting the processes that have gone on from looking at the archaeological evidence, looking at the evidence in the ground. And there you can see, there's the remains of a wall, and there's the collapse of a building. So, I mean, that's fairly obvious, isn't it? That's all broken. But then there's stuff on top, this softer sediment here. This is material that was washed down the hill. It's colluvial, hill wash. And hill wash here at Upper Rawlins contains almost all of the artefacts. So the artefacts are washing down the hillside from slightly higher, not very far up, further up, probably from the kitchen which lies here, and they're washing into these buildings. So all of the material that we're finding has been displaced and disturbed. So that was an interesting find, and it reinforces that problem that these upper, higher plantations had. The problem of the heavy rains reducing and washing away both the soil, washing it into these buildings, but also washing away those buildings. So you can start to see some of the problems that they were facing. So let's move on. There's the remains, fragmentary remains, because really they were not very well preserved. You've seen the evidence, but you can see fragments of wall, much of it washed away entirely. So we're left really with just fragments that we pieced together. And there you can see the steps that ran up, series of steps that ran up to the kitchen here, and this is where much of the material has come from. So when we're looking at finds and artefacts, which we're about to do, that's probably where many of these finds have come from. And this, one of the things that we try and do as archaeologists is stitch together these various sources of evidence. We're using sources of evidence which come from excavation, from looking at the layers and the structures that survive in great detail, and marrying those with the documentary evidence and the map evidence. And then we added a new dimension, which David will be talking about in a moment, in much more detail. And the new element is the finds, the artefacts, material culture, as we like to call it in archaeological circles. And the finds are often a really rather arbitrary selection of objects that have survived for various reasons. You don't get the wood surviving, certainly in these kinds of conditions. You won't get textiles. So there are lots of things that don't appear, don't survive. But the things that do survive, the durable material culture, are things like pottery and stone. This is a little pottery piece, and then a glass beam. And these are the artefacts that then enable us to date the layers from which they're come. So at Upper Rawlins then, which we talked about these early plantations going out of use early, well, this the finds from this plantation run from about 1680 to probably about 1720, 1730. So it's an early plantation, late 17th century, into the early 18th century. And then the finds stop. The artefacts then don't run on any longer, so any later. So you can see then, because there's nothing from the middle of the 18th century, that this plantation has been abandoned. And that is a very useful chronological indicator. But we can also tell, not only will the finds give us dating, but they'll tell us about things that were going on, the activities on the plantation. This little marble, well, kids play with marbles. Every site I dig seems to have marbles on it. But they're also used by adults. The adult gamers were also used marbles. Glass beads are very interesting. Some of these may have been used by the enslaved Africans in their hair, on their clothing, or as conventional bead necklaces. So there's a very interesting potential hint of the enslaved Africans on this plantation. There's a little whetstone, another whetstone there for sharpening knives, sharpening sharpening tools. And then some interesting, this one is fascinating, a single green glazed tile. Green glazed tiles are talked about in an early 18th century document. And it was as if many of the buildings in Nevis had green glazed roofs. Well, I don't know if they did, but there's not much evidence. But Upper Rawlins certainly seems to have one hint of that green glazed roof. And then there are other things. This is an interesting one. It's part of a skimmer, which would have been used to skim the detritus that bumped to the surface on a copper when the sugar was being made, and therefore almost certainly used by an enslaved African. There are beads, buckles, and there's a buckle, and then a little button there. Clay tobacco pipes were quite common. Very nice thing about clay tobacco pipes, like Nike trainers. Just as an odd one coming up here, Nike trainers. The kids all know the year that a Nike trainer was made because it's got that beading there, and then the next year they did this beading, and you think, that's a bit sad. But archaeologists are also rather sad because we do it with our clay tobacco pipes and our pottery and our glass bottles, because they also have typologies where the fashion has changed and we can chart the way in which this fashion has changed. Even the buckles, something as mundane and boring as a buckle, those are also quite datable from their style. And then another one. This is a hamstone. Was this a prehistoric piece of stone technology for pounding, or was this something that was used by the enslaved Africans? And of course, we will never know the answer to that, but it's one of those intriguing little points, which intriguing little objects, finds, which help us to understand the kind of things that have gone on at this site. So Upper Rawlins, a high plantation, abandoned by about 1720, 1730 at the latest, and not reoccupied, became pasture land, it seems, from the place names. So let's move to another kind of plantation, and we have the site over here with Wayne Knowles, who very kindly, who have been horrified that I'm picking him out, who very kindly allowed us to excavate for a couple of years on this property. This is a site which, in some ways, contrasts with Upper Rawlins, and in some ways actually reinforces the same pattern. Roger Leach noticed a building on Wade's property. This is a little stone building, and you might think, okay, well, there's loads of little stone buildings. What's so special about this? And if you look very carefully, you can see these little slots in the wall. And those slots held timbers. And so what we're looking at here is a building that began its life as a timber building with posts set in the ground, and then was encapsulated in stone, and then over time, those timber posts are rotted away. So what we're looking at, you might think, okay, well, that's all very interesting. And actually, it is more significant than it may seem, because these vertical slots, as part of that timber building, are a type of timber construction using posts in the ground, which was used in medieval England and fell out of use in medieval England in the 14th century. occasionally you find buildings later than that. So we're looking at a style of building that architectural historians associate with temporary, impermanent, they call it impermanent architecture. Architecture designed to be thrown up quickly, particularly in the tobacco industry in North America. Buildings built very quickly to get the plantation, get the tobacco growing, to get it active, to get it working, and then as funds accumulated to convert this into a more durable building. And I think the important thing about this stone, it's almost the sort of fossil impression of a building, is it may well have been the original house at the site at Fenton Hill. It's really called River Path, but we called it Fenton Hill at the beginning, and I'm afraid the name is stuck, so I know Wayne prefers River Path, so apologies, Wayne. But Fenton Hill then, this was, as I say, probably the first house, built probably somewhere in the 1650s, 60s, something like that. So, and then encapsulated in stone, and there you can see the walls, see these slots everywhere, and then the walls plastered over inside. This became the kitchen. And it became the kitchen to an adjacent building. So our little initial house was superseded, remained in use, but it was superseded by another house that was built next door to it. And Wade made a remarkable discovery, which I'll show you in a moment. There's just some archaeologists, including a rather younger version of me with hair. But the structure next door had a very, very interesting history, because here is the part of fragments of the Great House. It wasn't a huge Great House, but this is very likely to have been the third Great House, built in the early 18th century. It has, you can see the steps, and there are some tiles still on the steps. And then this shows you how carefully and how important it is as archaeologists to unpick the layers with great care, because what we're looking at is very, very subtle changes in those layers. And what we're looking at in this sequence here are the sequence of construction of the building, the occupation of it, and then the demolition of it. And the finds from those layers enable us to date each of those events, or each of those processes. So we end up from this excavation here with a very clear idea of what happened to this house. And the circumstance that really helped us most of all to understand the sequence was Wade's discovery of this remarkable find. It is the earliest date stone that I'm aware of on Nevis. It's exceptionally early, and it reads IC, and then a symbol which we're not really sure about, 1675. This is very, very early and very important, and was the key that unlocked our understanding of who owned this plantation. Because IC, or JC, because the I in the 17th century was represented a J as well. Very fortunately in Nevis, 3 years later, they did a census in 1678, and that census captured all of the European, British and some Dutch, but most of the British owners of the plantation. And the only character who would have merited a date stone of this order was a man called John Coombs, who was a merchant from Bristol. And Coombs, fortunately, left a will which gave us a large amount of information about his plantation, where he got the fragments of land, to piece them together. He got land from Widow Jones and Crook's land and another parcel of land, built them up into a very, very large plantation, probably over 300 acres, which is highly exceptional by Nevis standards. So Coombs then, this stone enabled us to work out two things. One was the sequence of buildings of the Great House, because this must have been a great house built of stone. And what happened to the Great House? Well, we know that in 1706, the French boo hiss. Everybody has to boo hiss. Oh, sorry. I thought it was a poem. No. But there were sorry, apologies from the French people. I do agree. But the French, of course, possessed two ends of the island of St. Kitts, and during the 17th and 18th century, Britain and France were regularly at war with one another. So in 1706, the French took the opportunity to raid and destroy and steal everything they could, both on St. Kitts and on Nevis. And the chap who, in 1706, owned this plantation, Joseph Drury, was paid one of the largest amounts of money in compensation for the loss of his property. So what I think we can infer from that is that this house, the house on which this datestone stood, a stone house, surely, we wouldn't have a datestone on a wooden house, must have been burnt down in 1706 and replaced, and that matches exactly with the dating from those layers, that sequence of the house, the third house essentially, that I've just shown. And just to show you how very complicated this plantation is, when we began to look at the documentation, once we got the JC link and we found John Hughes' connection, there he is. He died in 1689, but his will details all the purchases. I'll be testing it at the end here, so I'm going to but then Joseph Drury, then Drury's daughter, for up to about 1746, and then 1746, the plantation was intact then. 1746 was divided into 6 portions, and the history of those portions, it was horrendously complicated. One of them, or about 3 of those portions, 3 of the 6, became the plantation now known as Fothergill's. And so John Fothergill, who was a famous physician in England, bought half of that, probably because some of the other people who owned portions before that were also physicians, probably a connection there, down to his sister when he died, and then it was this 320-acre plantation was then subdivided again. And one of those portions was Golden Rock. So we can see there that when Edward Huggins in 1799 bought a portion of Drury's plantation, that then became a separate plantation. So we have this very complicated picture of John Hughes amassing land, bit by bit, building up these parcels of land to make a viable plantation. But then it's divided, subdivided, and then it becomes a series of rather smaller but economically sensible plantations, such as Golden Rock, such as Fothergill's. So we can see that process of amalgamation and then fragmentation here. And there you can see this is where this site is. Fenton Hill is somewhere around here, I think. And there you can see that it's fallen out of use, so it's no longer identified as a plot. Fothergill's remained in use as the Golden Rock. So we can trace that descent. And there it is, sort of colour coded, so it's a little bit easier to see. But all of that coloured bit was John Coombs's 328, a huge plantation by Nevis standards. And okay, so we've looked at the plantation, we've looked at the documents a little bit. They are very complicated, but what about the material culture? What about the finds that have come from there? And what do they tell us about the site and the people who lived there and the activities that went on at the site? And we can see straight away from this very fine baluster glass, drinking glass, probably dated to the first part of the 18th century. And there are more examples. There are 2 more here. And then a very large sample of liquor bottles too, which is, according to the records, a hazard in Nevis during the 18th century was over-consumption of alcohol. Never heard of that before. I'm sure nobody know anything about that. So there we have. So that's just a little fragment there of the finds that we're getting from Fenton Hill. But these are finds that are commensurate with the status of the plantation. These are high-quality glassware you would expect to see at the table of somebody of considerable resources. So we've looked at two plantations, we've contrasted them and seen some parallels, seen similarities between them. So, but the missing element so far is where did the enslaved Africans live, which is they were the economic driver of these plantations. They were the people who did the work. And so a project in 2009, I think it was, that was run by the DAX organisation in Monticello in Virginia, University of Southampton, and National Museums and Galleries on Merseyside, which is where I used to work. We did a project to look at where these plantation enslaved villages, African villages were. And one of the few maps or plaques, I think you call them in North America, of a plantation in Nevis is this one of Jessop's, which is in, I think it's in Southampton Record Office. But given that we were looking for the villages of the enslaved Africans, which is invisible, you need really to be guided by the map. Fortunately, this map did two things. One is it plotted where this the enslaved African village was in about 1750, and then somebody had annotated it a little bit later on, and it says, again, I'm quoting here, Negro houses. So the slave village then moved from there to there. There you can see, again, look at that little compact works and great house following that same pattern. So a series of test pits then cut across the ground. This is actually a different site, but the same principle. Cutting a series of test pits to see what kind of artifacts came out of the ground. What could we find which were the material traces of the slave village, given that material remains of the houses, wooden houses often perhaps raised up on rocks, well, I don't know. You're not going to find, unless you're very, very fortunate, much in the way of visible traces. So finding the artifacts by testing is an alternative way to examine what went on in these slave villages. And here is a bit of a concatenation of different slave villages, but it shows a very interesting pattern. And David will talk more about pottery in a moment. So this is Chinese porcelain, this is pearl ware, which again David will talk about. There's fragments of a pewter utensil, a spoon or a knife, or a fork, or probably a knife actually. And then a liquor bottle rim, fragments of clay tobacco pipe with a decoration on it, and then small fragments of drinking vessels. Now these are coming from the villages of the enslaved Africans. So what we're seeing here may be something, you think, what is Chinese porcelain doing in the village of the enslaved Africans? And there are probably three main explanations for that. One is that they were acquired illicitly. Another is that they were acquired as gifts from the plantation owner. And plantation owners were recorded giving gifts at particular points of people's lives. When women gave birth, for instance, that would be a point in somebody's life when the plantation owner, assuming they were of remotely benign intent, would have given gifts to the enslaved Africans. And the other way, of course, is by acquiring these things through the slave market. And one day a week was set aside, Sunday set aside, when the slaves were able to go to the market and to acquire goods at the market, to bring their produce, their chickens and the provisions that they'd grown on their provision grounds in their own time, and then engage in market activity, engage in trade. So it becomes then, there are therefore different sources by which different routes by which the enslaved Africans may have acquired those goods. So some of our surprises in Chinese porcelain may be explained by one or other of those. Because Elaine Morris, who's the expert on Afro-Caribbean pottery, is sitting at the back, I'm going to pass very quickly on, because anything I say may be taken in evidence and used against me for it. So all I would say is that this is Afro-Caribbean pottery, almost certainly made by the women and used in the enslaved African culture, in their cooking and in the slave villages, but also probably used in the plantation houses themselves, because this material also gets into the areas around the plantation.
So locally made. Locally made,
so
locally made.
Yes, so locally made, on fire, probably made on the plantation itself. And there are a lot of research on this. There are numerous, probably numerous sources of pottery on the earth. Cornelius at Newcastle Pottery is making similar kinds of wares in a similar kind of tradition to that Afro-Caribbean pottery. And then we can see here, again, buttons that are covered in gold. These are gilt buttons. These were highly prized in the 18th century amongst the enslaved Africans. And this is the kind of material that we would expect to see traded at those markets. And then again, imported tobacco pipes, which were smoked, maybe hand-me-downs, we don't know. We don't really know the biography of every object, but we can make some educated guesses. And then slight curiosities, a gun flint, a musket shot, a lead shot for a musket. And it may be that trusted enslaved Africans would have had weapons to guard, protect the plantation. So what I've tried to do is, in a whistle-stop tour which went from St. Kitts to a series of sites in Nevis, is to give you just a flavour of some of the main highlights, the main sort of themes that we've identified through the archaeology. And again, just to stress how important in terms of historical archaeology, how important it is to draw together all the sources that are available. So the finds can sometimes give us a surprising pattern, surprising picture, as you can see in finding the material that we might not expect necessarily in enslaved African villages. But we can also see the way in which those finds enable us to date the site, and they date sites that don't enter into the documentation. So we can't see Upper Rawlins until 1762 in the documents, but we know it's already gone out of use by then from the finds. So it's meshing those sources of evidence here provides us with a really quite rich idea of what was happening on those sites. And I will hand over to my very good friend. Oh, I haven't got one. Oh, in that case, I will hand it over to David Garner.
Thank you very much, Rob. You set the scene beautifully. Is this okay? Yes. Sounds a bit echoey. You set the scene beautifully for what's really going to be a much more, I think, picturesque talk. I'm one of those people that look at finds or a particular class of find. And I first came to Nevis in 1998 at the invitation of Channel 4's Time Team, who at the time were making a television programme based around three small excavations. The first was at Mount Travis, the plantation house. The second was at what was thought to be the site of Jamestown, the first town on the island, mistakenly. And the third was over at Coconut Walk, a prehistoric site. I was involved in the first two of those, particularly at Mount Travis. I'd worked with the Time Team earlier that year, actually, on my own patch back in North Staffordshire, when they filmed a programme looking for Josiah Wedgwood's first factory. So that's how I got to know them and how they got to know me. And when they came out to Nevis, they realised they needed somebody to advise on the ceramics that they knew they were going to be finding. Time team were only here for a week, which allowed precious time to study the material that came out of the ground. Certainly not time to prepare any substantial report on these. Sorry, I'm doing my computer space. There we are. Yeah. And it has to be said that the quantity of material that came from Mount Travis more than justified our presence on the island. We had a whale at the time. I think they excavated well in excess of 1,000 shards of English, mostly English pottery, from a number of different trenches, 8 trenches. And then test pitting over at Jamestown produced another small haul, all of which I would have loved to have had the time to deal with. And I didn't.
Wrong computer.
No, I'm working on 2.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, why ceramics? Rob's talked about the importance of finds, but ceramics have a particular place in most people's hearts, I think. They're very much associated with the 2 best things in life, or 2 of the 3, the third being music, food and drink. And they're very much at the heart of the consumption of food at meal times, storage of food, and of course the storage and serving and consumption of liquids, which is great. So I should have a printed sheet of this, but never mind. So, why ceramics? Now, I was standing in the back and I was pretty much struggling to read what was on the screen, so I shall do what I don't like doing in a lecture, and that's reading out what is on the screen. But ceramics were, of course, used by virtually everybody. People across the social scale, and as such, they're the largest class of artefact found on almost every archaeological site, which is very helpful. They also survive in the ground when artefacts of other materials do not. It's very hard to destroy a piece of pottery. And so we have an abundance of this material. And Rob was talking about the way in which artefact styles change over time. The clay tobacco pipes, glass drinking vessels and bottles, exactly the same with ceramics. They're not just vessels for consumption and use. They're objects in which we define ourselves by what we own, by what we use. So we're always looking for the latest fashion, the latest style, something to show our position in society. And because they change, as with the clay tobacco pipes, they're very important in terms of dating archaeological deposits. So we can learn from ceramics, we can gain evidence from many aspects of daily life, not just eating and drinking, but bathroom habits, very much associated with health and hygiene. They give us the evidence for trade. Where do they come from? How is the consuming population interacting with merchants, with seaboard trade, and also dealers and merchants back in the colonial homeland? And of course, they can be used, they're often seen as indicators of social and economic status. A cheap piece of pottery is going to tell us a lot about your means. A highly expensive, valued piece of pottery suggests you probably have the wherewithal to sustaining these items. By looking at the range of material on sites, we can begin to make some judgments. All of them will not be correct, but we make those judgments nonetheless and use the evidence to the best of our ability. And of course, we deal with small pieces, not just whole parts. The small shards are almost as useful as the complete thing. So the masses of material that come out of excavations, far from being complete, are extremely useful. So I've been back on Nevis several times since the time team days in 1998. I've been brought over by Roger Leach, who Rawlins mentioned, to look at ceramic finds from a number of excavations, including Mount Travers, Rob mentioned Fenton Hill. And I'm glad to say that some of the material I've looked at and reported on, some of this material has been published. A couple of reports in the volume that Rob edited, another overview of ceramics from archaeological ceramics from Nevis in a volume on the archaeology of the Caribbean more generally. I've got other reports in preparation, and hopefully in due course they will see the light of day. And so, over the years, I've studied the ceramics from a number of sites. And in doing so, we're looking at what is present, how they're being used, how the ceramics change over time, and trying to tease out some of this evidence that you see here. In actual fact, broad patterns do emerge. Given that Britain was England and then Great Britain were the colonial powers, was the colonial power, we would not be surprised, obviously, to find that the majority of ceramics on the island came from Great Britain, but that was not exclusively the case. Nevis, Britain, part of a much wider mercantile world at the time. And what we see on Nevis is pretty much what we see in most port towns, port cities across the UK. And that is a mix of material. And what we're having here on the island is British goods, European goods, albeit European goods which have passed through British ports for onward shipment. And during the 17th and early 18th centuries, you get this feel of a cosmopolitan centre with items from all over Western Europe. We see ceramics from Britain's developing pottery-making centres around London, around Bristol, Liverpool, North Devon, and even North Staffordshire by that time. There is a large component of British material, but there's also a sizable component of non-British goods. Wow, those colours look a bit bright. But a range of material from sites in North Devon, major pottery producing industry at that time. North Devon slipwares are quite common finds on these early 17th century and early 18th century sites. I'm not talking about any one site particularly here, but across the board, they're widespread. And another product of North Devon, which we find in abundance here, are these rather coarse utilitarian vessels used for storage and food preparation, so-called gravel temple wares, rightly named as their honking roots. And then we have something such as this, a little more refined, an attempt at decoration, surface treatment. Not necessarily that much more expensive, but already you get a feel for wares which we used in a different way. Not for storage, but for serving food, for drinking, and such like. Essential activities, but slightly more refined activities. Have a range of stonewares from various centres in England. Now, some of these pieces I would have liked to illustrate with good examples, but with the internet access, I've had to go for some rather less complete ones, which I had on my laptop at the time. So the small shards are from Nevis sites, and the larger pieces from an excavation in North Staffordshire, but it hopefully gives you an idea of the sort of mug that was being used here on Nevis and imported from North Staffordshire around about 1700, 1710. And other stonewares were being brought in from Germany in vast quantities. You remember the little chap on the first slide from the Time Dig? That's the sort of bottle that he would have come from. It's a stoneware, glazed stoneware bottle made in the Rhineland and shipped all over the Western, across the Atlantic, to the Caribbean, the North American colonies, throughout Europe. A massive industry, and you find these types of wares everywhere. They're functional, they're shipped as vessels in their own right, not as containers. And then something a little more elaborate are these, still German, still from the Rhineland, decorated drinking mugs, decorated chamber pots, big jugs, instantly recognisable by the moulding, the blue colour, and often the initials of the reigning monarch, in this case, Queen Anne, and up there is George I. We have earthwares from North Italy. Small shards, but they are very common. And again, I struggled to find a complete example, so we'll have to go for a more complete archaeological example. But you get the impression. These were functional wares that were decorative. They were probably not terribly expensive, but they're easily recognisable. And we're still looking at the late 17th, early 18th century here. This is the earlier period. And then, decorated, again we have a range of tin-glazed wares from numerous factories in the UK and England, but also major industry in Holland. Very often the wares from England and from Holland are difficult to tell apart. I think what we have here are all English pieces. Well, I put up some plates just to remind you that people at the higher end of society probably did sit down for formal meals, which involved eating off plates with knives and forks, which were becoming more common at that time. They're great to look at, they're not brilliant to use, because as you can see, the glaze does tend to flake off, and you really don't want glaze in your meal. But we're looking, again, late 17th, early to mid 18th century, some of the possibilities. And then tiles. Tin glazed tiles, definitely from the Netherlands. They're charming, they're absolutely delightful in their own right. But how they've been used. And you are making a statement with this. This is top-end plantation house interior. And this is probably exactly the sort of environment in which these tiles would have been used as a fireplace surround. So quite often we find ourselves looking at the top end of the social scale of the ceramics. They're certainly the ones that are more easily dealt with. And there's clearly evidence for tea drinking on the island. Chinese porcelain. There was nothing comparable in the British potter's repertoire in the early part of the 18th century from which tea could be drunk. So those people with the money, and this stuff was expensive, those people with the money bought Chinese porcelain for consumption of tea. And as you can see, this, again, is very much a high-end family. They're not just using Chinese porcelain, but they've got a whole array of tea-making equipment in silver, sugar bowl, milk jug, teapots and kettles, spoon trays. So this is very much top end, and remains so until sufficient quantities of Chinese porcelain were being shipped from the Orient to Western Europe to bring the prices down. And we do see evidence on the island for porcelain tablewares, not just teawares. Not very impressive when they come out of the ground, but you can get an idea of how they would have looked en masse in a plantation house. And this would have been adorning a table set for half a dozen, 8, 10 or 12 people. And believe me, they were magnificent. And of course, we've got the sugar industry. These are the finds that are regularly coming out of the ground, both on plantation sites and elsewhere. The sugar molds on the left and the drip jars on the right, all part of the industry. And like Rob, I'm going to steer clear of the Afro-Caribbean industry that does turn on sites here. Now, we've got a little bit of a conundrum, and we chew over this quite frequently. The British ceramic industries begin to develop, really take off in the middle years of the 18th century. They have a massive export trade to North America, the Caribbean, to Europe, and they're really coming to dominate the market. We're not seeing a huge amount of this stuff on the sites that I've looked at so far. And the question is, why? What's going on? Is it an accident of survival? Are we looking in the wrong places? Or are we missing stuff? Are we dating things a little too early or a little too late? It's a problem that we need to address. But what I would say is that the sort of material that we are looking at for the middle of the 18th century could well be Chinese porcelains that we've just seen. But certainly the Staffordshire potters were making these white stoneware dinnerwares, which were finding a market amongst the middling classes. It's not expensive, it's not best quality, but it's white, and it's versatile, and it was used across the Western world. But by the 1770s, there was a new trend creeping in. The fashionable plantation owner over here, or the fashionable landowner back in the UK, would have been looking beyond the blue and white Chinese porcelain for the high-end wares. Josiah Wedgwood made plain white earthenware fashionable simply by crawling up to the Queen, seeking patronage and exploiting, milking it for all it was worth. So what was introduced as creamware suddenly became queensware, which adds a bit to the price, doesn't it? And again, we ought to be seeing masses of this on the islands, and we're not. I mean, it's there, but I would expect to see a lot more, as we do back in the UK. You know, a few plate rings like that are all very well and good, but this is the sort of thing that they would be from, mostly without decoration. However, amongst the creamwares that we do have, there are some very special pieces. Well, one special piece in particular, and it is this. It's a small piece of dessert ware, a sauce tureen, something like that, which has the crest of the Preta Pinning family from Mantras. That is the only example from Mantras excavation, which is pretty special. There are a few shards of creamware with these painted edges clearly matching the tree cover. So we think we've got a glimpse of John Pinney's tablewares at that time, but we've not seen a huge amount of them. I'm just very thankful that we have this. That said, the documentary evidence does help. If I can just find this on the other computer, wait a second. Here we are. John Pinney was actively buying Queen's ware, so he was right up there with the contemporary fashion, the latest, the classiest ware, and he was buying. On the 3rd of June 1776, he ordered a range of ceramic goods from Peter Eaton at Bristol, which included Queen's ware and common blue and white china, the stuff you've seen before, the Chinese porcelain. And the order included 1 dozen teacups and saucers, 3 dozen saucers, and as regards to china, he's not really bothered what he gets. He said any sort or kind will do. If there are different patterns, it's a material. So, consumer choice, well, just give me anything. We can make rather too much of these decisions that people make or don't make in this case. July 14, 1777, John Pinney placed an order with Nathaniel Martin for various earthenwares and in Queen's ware, 3 dozen shallow plates and 4 pudding dishes in 2 sizes. 18th of June 1778, he ordered 6 dozen white stone chamber pots and a Queen's ware tureen from Mills Swanston of London. And then in the same year, he bought 2 blue and white china tureens with covers and dishes, which cost him £6, 12 shillings. That's quite an outlay on pots. Also, 24 dozen of long china dishes, presumably rectangular serving dishes, different sizes, which cost an amazing £9 and 18 shillings, as well as the 12 Queen's ware dishes, 60 shillings, and 6 dozen plates in Queen's ware, 6 shillings. He liked his posh. Did he finish? So, as I say, the documentary evidence is there, but the finds are there, they're rather elusive. And it may be, of course, that what Pinney is buying is not entirely for his own use. You know, he may have been redistributing them amongst friends, customers, or whatever. And there's one piece of evidence that suggests that that might have been the case in February 1786. Messrs. Pinney and Tobin asked Messrs. Ackerman and Co., China merchants at Fenchurch Street in London, to dispatch a substantial quantity of china by the first ship to Nevis or St. Kitts. And this order comprised 12 dozen meat plates, 12 dozen soup plates, 12 punch bowls in 3-quart, 2-quart, and 1-pint sizes, as well as 3 dozen cups and saucers and 6 tureens, and 2 complete dinner sets. All were to be, I quote, of neat patterns, carefully put up. So again, he's not too bothered what he gets, but he wants nice stuff. Actually, this is where I come in. I'm here doing a little research project, and what I'm looking at is the 19th century material that is present on some of these sites. So it's just the sort of stuff that John Penny is buying at this period. Queensware was fashionable. It was fashionable for 3 decades, 4 decades, but by 1800, 1810, there's a new kid on the block, and that is earthenware decorated with transfer prints with all manner of subjects, Oriental, Chinese landscapes, European scenery. You'll see a few in a moment. And one of the chief suppliers of quality goods in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was, of course, Josiah Wedgwood. Pinney was well aware of this because in 1807, December 1807, John Penny and John Frederick Penny II wrote to a merchant in London about goods which had not been delivered. And he referred to a crate, Wedgwood's ware, at 4 shillings and 4pence per crate. That's important. We know that we have documentary evidence that Pinney is engaging with the most fashionable wares at the time. And this is also the period when the archaeological finds give us a wealth of manufacturers' marks, including at least 5 Wedgwood backstamps from Anna Travers. Actually, there are many others. We've got other well-known manufacturers such as Spode, the Herculaneum Pottery in Liverpool, and Deacon and Bailey from Stoke-on-Trent. They're non-entities in comparison to these factories, but by looking at manufacturers' marks, we can get a clear idea of the types of wares, where they're coming from, and the sort of cachet attached to these. So this is my project, to look at a range of 19th century, particularly the transfer printed wares from local sites. And a lot of these are from Mount Travis. But I think my excitement was fueled when I was here 14 months ago, and we were looking at material from the excavations of Jamestown. I began to see things that I remembered from the Mount Travis excavation. And we were looking at the same types of ware on many different sites. And at Mount Travis, there's an awful lot of dinnerware and dessertware. From the archaeological material, you can get a real picture of fine dining or life within a plantation house. I think we've identified something like 4 early 19th century dinner services. In fact, this could be one of those Wedgwood services that John Penny ordered. It's a pattern which we know that Josiah Wedgwood introduced in 1805, and it really is very common. As is this. Same period. Don't know who made this, but somebody had a penchant for chinoiserie and the Chinese. They certainly did. These are examples of the dinner services which would have been in use, presumably on special occasions at Mount Travis. And things change. Time goes on, styles change, new fashions. By the 1830s, the dominant pattern up at Mount Travis and elsewhere seems to be this European landscape called Moria. Bit fussy, not quite the quality. Get an impression that things are dropping off a bit here. That the same amount is not being spent on household ceramics. And of course, there are the cheaper wares. Now, we all know willow, we all love willow, but in its day, it was ubiquitous. It's also the cheapest type of decorated printed ware available. And if you want to go even further down the scale, we've got these shell edge moulded wares, which were used by just about everybody. So there is some stratification going on here in the ceramics as well. I would say almost anybody could afford those at the bottom. And as the 19th century progresses, things really do go downhill. The patterns are sometimes quirky, but generally just not very accomplished. These are not the best wares. And why on earth anybody at Man Travels would need to have a piece commemorating the London Liverpool Royal Mail? I do not know. That piece dates 1737. But things ain't what they were. And as the 19th century progresses, we go even further downhill. Now, I like to think that we can look at the ceramics and get a broader picture of the economic state of the environment in which they're being lived. And I presume from the ceramics that things were not quite so prosperous in the second half of the 19th century as they were previously. But we're also getting new suppliers of ceramics. These are Scottish pieces. Okay, still British, but the industries of Glasgow and thereabouts really take off in the mid-19th century and have a massive trade with the Caribbean. These are printed wares made by Jane N.P. Bell of Glasgow. They're quite common on the island. They're quite average in terms of quality. There's Jane N.P. Bell again, shards. Actually quite interesting because these pieces are from plates of this design, and the design was called Amboina. They were made for the East Indian market, not the West Indian market. Somebody made a mistake there, I think, but just representative of the wide range of Jane N.P. Bell's material is here on the island. I'm sorry, things do go from bad to worse. Decoration invariably equates with price. The more decoration, generally the higher the price. But it depends on the type of decoration. You can go a bit over the top with things like these sponge decorating pieces. They're bright, they're cheerful. They're decorated by kids back home, young, 5, 6, 10-year-olds. They cost no money to make. They're very mediocre quality at best. But they found a massive market, not just in the Caribbean, North America, in Europe, South Africa, and in all places to the east. They were the cheapest decorated wares you could find. The next stage, the next step down was ware with no decoration whatsoever. And this is the typical later 19th century material, not just from Nevis, but from many colonial outposts. It's bright, it's cheerful, but it's not quality. And I think its more widespread use suggests that things are not as healthy financially as they were, or economically as they were, and that some of the customers were unable to stretch themselves beyond this. And then, of course, the other thing that we do find consistently on sites are the vessels which have specific functions, whether it's bottles for holding spirits, flower pots. That's an ink bottle and a small ink pot. These are quite ubiquitous. Not a huge amount we can say about them. They come from England. They came out with the contents with ink or with blacking or other household products, liquor, spirits in some of the larger bottles. Typical finds across the Western world. Well, Nevis has remained consistently British since it was first settled by Europeans. And inevitably, the ceramics present on the island reflect this. We see a preference for British ceramics, and amongst the rich, we see a preference for the best quality British ceramics. But depending on which site, which period that we're looking at, we can expect a mix. There are European wares in the 17th and 18th century alongside the British goods, which reflects the state of the market at that time, and also the size and scale of the industries in places like Germany and the Netherlands. By the mid-19th century, they have been very much overtaken by the pottery industries of Great Britain, hence a massive influx of material at that time. Away from the plantation house, a British taste of sorts is still evident, albeit reflecting a different environment, both cultural and climatic. But further study of this area may well prove fruitful. And it's certainly interesting to consider how emancipation in the island affected the choice of ceramics and also the manner of their use. And I think, by looking at the later 19th century, we can come back to this idea that the ceramics reflect the economic conditions in the island themselves. At a gap. But, as I say, I'm here on a research project looking at this material, and I should go straight to the acknowledgements and acknowledge funding from an American group, the Transferware Collectors Club. They love it, they love what we are intending to do here. I'm very grateful to them for funding this research, which will be ongoing for a couple of years yet. Beyond that, however, access to the archaeological collections essential. Very much indebted to the NHCS and to Warner, therefore, assistance in gaining access